Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, here in Rome, and good morning to those who live in the further west. My name is Isabella Bruckner. I'm head of the chair Christian Thought and Spiritual Practice. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you here in Aula 11, in Aula 11, at the Pontificio Ateneo Sant'Anselmo on the Aventine Hill in Rome. And I also welcome all the participants online, near and far. In particular, I want to welcome our speaker for today, Professor Bernard McGinn, who honors us today with his presence. He will talk to us from the south side of Chicago and share with us his studies and reflections on a very special woman, often called a modern mystic, namely Simone Weil. Before we present our guest speaker, I want to ask Professor Fernando Rivas, Director of the Monastic Institute, for a brief welcome.
We are very honored to receive Professor McGinn here in a classroom of the Monastic Institute of Sant'Anselmo, Rome. We thank you very much to have this possibility, also because the subject so rich, speaking about Simone Weil. And so thank you very much in the name of the rector, the Ateneos, and also to Isabella Bruckner, that she gave us this possibility for our students and also for the whole institute. Thank you very much and welcome for all of you.
So once again, welcome Bernard, also from my side. It's truly a gift to have you join us today. For all of you who do not know me, my name is Andreas Telser, and I work as a postdoc researcher at the University of Vienna. Let me briefly introduce Professor McGinn to you. Bernard McGinn is the Naomi Shenstone Donnelly Professor Emeritus of Historical Theology and of the History of Christianity in the Divinity School of the University of Chicago and the Committees on Medieval Studies and on General Studies that are also located there. Almost 63 years ago, if I counted correctly, Bernard, you finished a licentiate in Rome at the Gregorian and then went on for a PhD at Brandeis University, where Professor McGinn finished a thesis on the 12th century Cistercian mystical author Isaac of Stella. So maybe that kind of brought you in this direction and never let you leave it again. By now, of course, 63 years later, McGinn is rightly considered the preeminent historian of Western Christian mysticism. The 7, or depending on the counting, the 9 volumes of the series, The Presence of God, range from the beginning of mysticism until its crises in the 17th century, mainly Spain, Italy, and France. And I can assure you, none of these books is lightweight in any sense of the word. In his writings, Bernard McGinn integrates theology, exegesis, liturgy, and social history. which then taken together allows the reader to understand how and why mystical discourse has emerged in specific times, in specific communities, and in specific languages. Clarifying these contexts and learning about the various genres that were used, be that sermons, commentaries, poetry, or visionary narratives, this can illuminate the recurring interplay of cataphatic and apophatic currents and their meaning. In addition, McGinn is also a leading interpreter of medieval apocalypticism and how it should be read critically. His sensitivity for and knowledge of this era has become surprisingly urgent in our times, where political movements openly flirt with apocalyptic thinking, yet often in a rather simplistic or even distorted manner. McGinn's expertise of the large variety of texts in various languages made him prone to be the ideal mediator of the classics of Western spirituality, a series in which he wrote, among others, about Meister Eckhart and apocalyptic spirituality. Thus, McGinn is scholar and teacher in one person. He does not only catalog the wide range of mystics, but he also entices us to read them, and he teaches us how to do that responsibly. What we hear today, and this is McGinn's own explanation, which I take from the preface of his 2023 book, Modern Mystics, is the fruit of the COVID pandemic of 2020. And I quote McGinn, "The fact that my mind still seemed to be working," unquote. So thanks so much, Bernard, for being our guest, who will now invite all of us as you lead us through Simone Weil's Dialectical Mysticism. The floor is yours, Bernard.
Buonasera a tutti, and also thank you so much, Andreas, for your kind words, and also for Isabella to extend the invitation for me to give this talk. I'm very, very happy to be able to do this and to be back in Rome once again, if only visually and through electronic media. So I will talk today about Simone Weil, who I think is one of the most important of the 20th century mystics, and whom I've read for many years, but finally got to write something on her in detail in the Modern Mystics book that you mentioned. Naming Simone Weil as a mystic is an exercise fraught with difficulties, perhaps even contradictions. Mystical theology, as Dionysius taught, is that which cannot be spoken. It is hidden, obscure, lost in the cloud of unknowing. If we cannot name the mystical, but only suggest it, point in its direction, how shall we declare with confidence who is and who is not a mystic? And yet we are impelled to speak and to name. Just as the great mystics found it their task to announce and write down the message they have been given, we too are asked to address the question today, who is fittingly termed a mystic? Is Simone Weil in that number? And if so, what is the nature of her mystical contribution? When I am asked who is a mystic, my answer has tended to become more and more simple. Rather than present an involved discussion on the basis of the heuristic notion of mysticism set out in my series, The Presence of God, I now tend to answer, a mystic is someone who takes God seriously. Or to amend it slightly, a mystic is someone who takes God really seriously. Rightly understood, for me, mysticism is a broad category, not a narrow one. And so I would not exclude anyone who seriously pursues encountering God on a deep level from the ranks of the mystic. And on that basis, there can be no question in my mind that Simone Weil is a mystic. What kind of a mystic is Simone Weil? I do not claim to be able to give a full account of what Weil tells us about God and human contact with God, but I will try to locate her as a mystic by employing a few general categories that can serve to introduce her and suggest something of her accomplishment. I would say that Weil is a modern mystic, an apophatic mystic, and a dialectical mystic. Weil is a modern mystic not just because she lived in the 20th century, but because she addressed particular issues raised by modernity, issues that did not confront the classic mystics prior to the Enlightenment and the crisis of Catholic quietism. Among these issues are the new scientific view of the physical universe, the changing conception of human nature, questioning of traditional religious structures and practices, a recasting of the relationship of theory and praxis, the ecumenical attitude toward other religions, and many, many other issues. Weil was a profoundly modern person, caught up in the intellectual, political, cultural issues of the 1930s and 1940s. I have also suggested that Weil, along with others, but as an early representative, is a part of the revival of apophatic, or the negative dimension of theology and mysticism. Became especially evident in the last decades of the past century. Now, there's a long tradition of apophatic mysticism in Christianity, stretching back as far as Clement of Alexandria. But this was occluded during the triumph of the Enlightenment, only to return with force in the present century. Thomas Aquinas put the apophatic dimension succinctly when he said, I quote, Deus tamquam ignotum cognoscimus. We know God as something unknown. Of course, all major mystics are both cataphatic, yes-saying, and apophatic, or no-saying. But it is the proportion and the mode of the interaction between the two styles of discourse in individual mystics that tells us much about the character of their message. The apophatic dimension of mysticism was often forgotten in the early modern period, but as I mentioned, it experienced a strong re-emphasis, a resurfacing, if you will, in the past century. Lastly, I've also described Weil as a dialectical mystic in the tradition of Dionysius, John Scotus Eriugena, Meister Eckhart, Marguerite Porete, Nicholas of Cusa, and many others. By speaking of Weil as a dialectical mystic, I mean that she customarily thinks in terms of opposites. Opposites that need to be brought together in order to bring out the higher meaning of the opposed terms. And these opposing poles are not destroyed or negated, but they're transformed on a higher level. This form of dialectical reversal is characteristic of Weil. Some examples of such oppositions in her thought are good and evil, decreation and redemption, gravity and grace, necessity and freedom, presence and absence, two kinds of nothingness, two kinds of obedience, etc. Examples of such oppositions, paradoxical formulations, are evident throughout her writings. I'm just going to cite two texts from her notebooks. She says, everything is upside down in our world of sin. What is negative appears as positive. What is authentically and fully positive appears to us as negative. This constitutes a criterion. What appears to us as positive never is, cannot possibly be positive. Thus, good doesn't ever consist of doing good, but of not doing evil. Second text from the notebooks. Contact with human creatures is given us through a sense of presence. Contact with God is given us through a sense of absence. Compared with this absence, presence becomes more absent than absence. So binary oppositions and contradictions and their overcoming characterized by his thought. And I would suggest that she addresses contradictions in at least two ways. The first is by laying hold of the oppositions, forcing them together in a kind of coincidence of opposites. Second way is by postulating a region of mediated good and evil, a dimension that Weil calls metaxu, a term taken over from Plato. This is the realm of mixed realities, examples of family, country, culture, etc. They're relative and mixed blessings that can be used as ways or bridges to reach God. Thus, the temporal realm is useful, but is not an end in itself. I quote her again. The temporal has no meaning except by and for the spiritual, but not by being mixed up with the spiritual. It is the temporal seen as a bridge, a metaxu. So I'm going to develop this talk in two sections. The first one will deal with Simone Weil's view of mysticism, and the second will take just a couple of the major themes, particularly practical themes of her thinking. I can do no more than deal with three of those. But first, I'm going to start with Weil's view of mysticism. Weil had a high appreciation of mysticism. In her essay, A War of Religions, she distinguishes three ways of dealing with the opposition of good and evil. The first is the irreligious way, namely to deny the reality of the opposition. The second way is evading the problem. The third way is what she calls the mystical way, and she describes it as follows. Mysticism means passing beyond the sphere where good and evil are in opposition, and this is achieved by the union of the soul with the absolute good. Like many mystics, Weil sometimes describe this union in sexual terms. She says, just as a girl is never the same after losing her virginity, so the soul that has experienced such union with God, is changed forever. So Weil, like many mystics, saw union with God as a defining characteristic of mysticism. In Waiting for God, for example, she says, man has the right to desire direct contact, direct union with God alone. In her notebook, she further observes, again a quotation, man is only able to become one with God by uniting himself to God, stripped of his divinity. This quotation shows Weil's distinctive view of mystical union, and this is in line with her general metaphysics, namely that both man and God need to be divested of their particular being in order to be united. In other words, they both need to be emptied. They need to be decreated. They always had high praise for the third way of mysticism. In the first and last notebook, she says, mysticism should provide the key for all knowledge and all values. In The Need for Roots, she connects mysticism with living a life devoted to truth. She says, what is really marvelous, as in the case of the mystics and the saints, is not that they have more life, but that in them truth should become life. In the notebook, she discusses faith as a conjecture based on supernatural experiences, and also goes on to note that the privilege of mystical contemplation is an experience that is the reason why mysticism is the only source of the virtues. So she praises mysticism very highly, but she also distinguishes. Not all mysticism is good. They, like many others, distinguished between two kinds of mysticism. There is a false or spurious mysticism that is always searching for special experiences of God, and a true mysticism of absolute attention to God and some form of direct consciousness of his present absence. She says that the possessive desire to make beauty tangible and to arrive at some special state of experiencing God is a major error underlying the false mysticisms that she condemns. In order to understand Weil as mystic, We must also emphasize that her writings and her life, of course, provide evidence of her own moments of deep consciousness of God. Some of these accounts are very direct, others are more veiled and ambiguous. So let me briefly review the most important of these events in chronological fashion. Most of the earlier ones are found in her letter 4, the so-called spiritual autobiography that she wrote to her friend and spiritual director, Father Perrin, in May of 1942. The first experience came in the summer of 1935. While on vacation with her parents in Portugal, she tells us of watching the popular religious devotions in a small village and hearing the hymns of the wives of the fishermen. This overwhelmed her with the conviction that Christianity is preeminently the religion of slaves, that slaves cannot help belonging to it, and I among others. So this is not a purely intellectual conviction, but a deeply spiritual one, whether or not we would want to call it some form of mysticism. In July of 1937, however, during a 2-day visit to Assisi, she notes a much more direct experience of God. She writes, "There alone in the little 12th century Romanesque chapel of Santa Maria degli Angeli, an incomparable marvel of purity where St. Francis used to pray, something stronger than I was compelling me for the first time in my life to go down on my knees." It's very interesting here, this experience of being compelled to go down on her knees also echoed very much in the life of Etty Hillesum, if you've read her diary. That experience of having to kneel is the beginning of her conversion to a higher life. Third experience took place when Simone was on retreat at the Monastery of Solesmes during Holy Week and Easter Week in 1938. She says that during the course of these services, despite the splitting headache she was enduring, the thought of the passion of Christ entered into my being once and for all. Given the central role that Christ's passion plays in all her later religious thought, this brief reference seems to mark a major turning point in her life. During the same retreat, Weil provides a fourth account that she explicitly compares to the writings of the mystics. She tells us of how she admired the angelic radiance that a young English Catholic man showed when going to communion. He was the one who introduced her to the 17th century English metaphysical poets, including George Herbert. She learned Herbert's poem Love by heart and often recited it when suffering from headaches. She tells us she thought she was merely reciting a poem, only later realized that she was actually praying. And she goes on to say, it was during one of these recitations that Christ himself came down and took possession of me. Christ himself came down and took possession of me. What follows is revealing. Given her agnostic background, Weil had never conceived of the possibility of a real contact between a human being and God. She says, I had vaguely heard tell of things of this sort, but I had never believed them. But in this sudden possession of me by Christ, neither my senses nor imagination had any part. I only felt in the midst of my suffering the presence of love, like that which one can read in the smile on a beloved face. She goes on, I had never read any mystical works because I had never felt any need to read them. God, in his mercy, had prevented me from reading the mystics so that it should be evident to me that I had not invented this absolutely unexpected contact. Like Paul on the road to Damascus, the manifestation of Christ was a kind of out-of-the-blue experience, a life-changing experience. Now, this passage also raises the question of what Weil knew of Christian mystical traditions and how far mystical writings might influence this account and other later accounts. Weil was trained as a philosopher, and there's no reason to doubt her claim that she had not really read mystical texts before 1937. In the early 1940s, after her religious turn, she does talk about intensive reading of mystics, particularly John of the Cross in August 1941. And she mentions other mystics that she was reading, Teresa of Avila, Meister Eckhart, Marguerite Porete, etc. She always had a deep devotion to Francis of Assisi as a paragon of the love for and practice of poverty. And Francis is a good example for examining her spotty knowledge of the mystics. They knew and praised Francis's Canticle of the Sun. In The Need for Roots, she says, from a purely poetic point of view, it is infinitely preferable to have written the Canticle of St. Francis, that jewel of perfect beauty, than the entire works of Victor Hugo. She also knew the stories about Francis, some true, some apocryphal, found in the fioretti, the popular little flowers. But it was the figure of Francis, the model of poverty, the lover of beauty that inspired her. As she puts it in Waiting for God, all Francis's life was perfect poetry in action. They had also read Teresa of Avila, but she makes the strange comment that it would have been better if Teresa had never written her mystical classics. Doesn't tell us why. They read Thérèse of Lisieux's popular mystical autobiography, but she did not like it. She had a great admiration for John of the Cross. But once again, what impressed her was John's devotion to mystical annihilation under the image of the dark night, not so much the details of John's mystical writings. Meister Eckhart's influence is powerful, but again somewhat problematic. They mentions him explicitly only twice in her writings, as far as I've been able to determine, but it is clear that she read him in depth and responded to his particular form of dialectical mysticism in many ways. She does count him among what she calls the genuine friends of God. If this were another talk, I could investigate at least 5 or 6 major themes that show unusual convergence between these two mystics. But it is interesting that as she develops these themes in her own writings, Weil does not mention Eckhart's name explicitly. Weil's partial knowledge of mysticism is also reflected in several of her misunderstandings of the nature of mysticism. Like many in her time, and still some in ours, they regarded all mysticism across the ages and traditions as essentially the same. In a 1942 letter, she says, in practice, mystics belonging to nearly all the religious traditions coincide to the extent that they can hardly be distinguished. They represent the truth of these traditions. And from this perspective, it is not a surprise that they often spoke of mysticism as a kind of separate religion, independent from and superior to the institutional forms of religion that had been corrupted by what she called the great beast, totalitarian ideologies. The third misunderstanding is her view that the Catholic tradition regarded only those who wrote extensively about mystical states, people like Teresa and John of the Cross, as mystics, which is why she strangely thought, in a letter written to her brother, that Francis of Assisi was not listed among the mystics by Catholics. But I'd like to now return to Weil's own mystical experiences, especially 2 that she recounts from the last years of her life. After the Nazi conquest of France in 1940, Simone and her family fled Paris and located in the south of France. They soon moved on to Marseille, where Simone met Father Joseph-Marie Perrin, who became a close friend and spiritual director. And Father Perrin introduced her to Gustave Thibon, a right-wing Catholic farmer, lay philosopher, who also became her friend. Fulfilling a long-held desire to do hard physical labor, Simone worked in the French vineyards in the fall of 1941. It was during this time that she began praying the Our Father in Greek every day in order to practice perfect attention. She says, the effect of this practice is extraordinary and surprises me every time. For although I experience it each day, it exceeds my expectation at each repetition. At times, she goes on to say, the very first words tear my thoughts from my body, transported to a place outside space where there is neither perspective nor point of view. She describes this place as an infinity of infinity in which silence reigns. And in such moments, Christ again becomes present to her. Sometimes during this recitation or at other moments, Christ is present with me in person, but his presence is infinitely more real, more moving, more clear than on that first occasion when he took possession of me. Simone tells Father Perrin that the whole of this matter doesn't really concern her, but it's God's business, and God who perhaps likes to use castaway objects, waste, and rejects, things like herself. Later in the account, she says that although she remains on the threshold of the church, waiting en hypomene, in attentive, faithful immobility, only now, she says, my heart has been transported, forever I hope, into the Blessed Sacrament exposed on the altar. Kind of remarkable claim for someone who actually never became a Catholic. The Weil family were eventually able to leave Europe and sail to New York in June of 1942. Simone spent only a few months in New York, composing more notebooks and longing to return to work for the Free French movement led by Charles de Gaulle. It's apparently during this time that the final event I wish to mention took place. It's hard to characterize this account. Is it a dream, a waking vision, a mystical parable? Well, maybe all three. The narrative begins abruptly. He came into my room and said, you poor wretch who understand nothing and know nothing, come with me and I will teach you things you have no idea of. The figure leads her into a church and commands her to kneel. Then he leads her up to a garret with an open window, where for several days she engages in conversation with him and a number of other people. During this time, they share a kind of Eucharistic meal of bread and wine. But finally, he casts her out. One day he said to me, now go away. I threw myself down, clung to his knees, begged him not to send me away, but he flung me out towards the stairs. She then walked in sorrow through the town, not being able to find the house where it all happened. At the end, Weil reflects on this strange event, deciding that the visitor had come to her by mistake. But perhaps it was still a token of divine love. So she closes the account with the following haunting lines. I well know that he does not love me. How could he love me? And yet there is something deep in me, some point of myself, which cannot prevent itself from thinking with fear and trembling that perhaps, in spite of everything, he does love me. If then we can certainly say that Simone Weil enjoyed moments of mystical consciousness, experiences of a loving union with God and Christ, how did these come to effect and mold in her writings? So in this last part, I want to turn to some mystical themes in Weil's thought. Obviously, it's going to be very selective. Simone Weil was not a systematic writer. Aside from scattered articles, she wrote only one book during her life, The Need for Roots. It wasn't published until after her death in 1952. Her best-known works, Waiting for God, Gravity and Grace, were put together from her papers by Father Perrin and Gustave Thibon. Her 5 volumes of notebooks contain the core of her thinking, but in an unsystematic way. Nevertheless, her writings are extensive. 17 volumes in the complete works, which is not quite yet finished, and there's a huge secondary literature. I shall not try to give any full account of what could be called Weil's religious metaphysics. There are several good sketches of this in the vast amount of literature about her. Let me briefly mention, without explanation, some of the essential foundations of this metaphysics, and then turn in concluding to a slightly more expanded commentary on a few major themes of what I call her mystical practice. Under foundations, well, I've already mentioned the fundamental law of Weil's thinking, our use of contradictions and oppositions. And the section on contradictions in Gravity and Grace offers an introduction to this. But as is often the case with Weil, it consists of aphorisms to be pondered, not straightforward exposition. These aphorisms are kind of spiritual maxims, not unlike what we read in the writings of the Desert Fathers or in the Centuries of Evagrius Ponticus. Gustav Thiebaum once put it very well. He says, "We have to remember that she does not provide us with a solution, but with a question. Not a reply, but an appeal. Not a conclusion, but a need." So under these foundations, of course, there are at least 5 or 6 major headings that I cannot go into. God as the true and the good, creation as God's withdrawal, gravity and grace as the fundamental forces in the universe, the notion of redemption and healing God, and particularly the role that Christ on the cross plays in this, one of the most significant aspects of our thought. And finally, of course, the kind of problem. If the cross and Christ's death on the cross is so central, what about the resurrection? Simone Weil had a lot of trouble with the resurrection. She would have preferred it all to have stopped on the cross. But let me turn now, in conclusion, to the question of practices, and I want to talk specifically about 3 of these. Simone Weil was an eminently practical thinker, a guide to right action, a teacher of how to live. These are what I call her mystical practices, although they might just as well be called ethical practices. They might also be termed states or conditions of human existence. There are too many of these to be taken up in one short talk, so I want to focus only on 3, and what I'll call them the 3 A's: attention, affliction, and annihilation. In other words, I won't talk about many other key features: beauty, compassion, love, truth, work, etc., etc. First, attention. Title of Weil's best-known book, Waiting for God, indicates just how important attention is to her thought. This is how she defines it. Attention consists of suspending our thought, leaving it detached, empty, ready to be penetrated by the object. Attention looks to reception. Above all, our thought should be empty, waiting, not seeking anything, but ready to receive in its naked truth the object that is to penetrate it. So attention is a non-acting action, as she speaks of it. This definition of hints of an affinity between Weil and Eckhart for whom detachment and releasement was so important. Both mystics emphasize the necessity for decentering the self. As Weil puts it, we must give up our imaginary position at the center and renounce it, not only intellectually, but in the imaginative part of the soul, so that we can awaken to what is real and eternal, to see the true light and hear the true silence. Thus, we can come to realize that all the points of the world are equally centers, and the true center is outside the world. They emphasizes the relation between attention and its object more positively, I think, than Eckhart's more negative view of detachment, but that's another question. In her notebooks, she puts it this way: attention is what seizes hold of reality, so that the greater the attention on the part of the mind, the greater the amount of real being in the object. On the human level, attention is important in interpersonal relations, especially our relation to those who are subject to affliction. Simone Weil's attention is a transcendental practice to be applied in a universal way. That is, it should govern our attitude toward God, toward the world, and toward other people. She seems to have worked towards this very general viewpoint by investigating the role of attention in education. And many of you will be familiar with her famous essay, Reflections on the Right Use of School Studies with a View to the Love of God. In this paper, she sees school studies as a preparation for the higher attention needed in prayer. because attention is the substance of prayer, according to Weil. Attention is a waiting, not a grasping. We do not lay hold of God, we wait for him to lay hold of us. Attention is therefore a looking at God, and we can also say it is a looking for God. The human will in its natural and sinful state is not capable of making itself truly attentive. Attention is possible only as an exercise of desire, a desire which itself is marked by grace. Grace, the force that reverses the pull of the gravity of creation that separates us from God. As she puts it in her text in Waiting for God, religion, on the contrary, as opposed to will, corresponds to desire, and it is desire that saves. Attention is both an emptying of the self as well as an ecstatic passing beyond the self. And paradoxically, the subjective genitive, that is our waiting for God, can also be used objectively to describe God's waiting for us, because God is pure attention without distraction. In one place she says, God and humanity are like two lovers who have missed their rendezvous. Each is there before the time, but each at a different place. They wait and wait and wait. The second theme I'd like to talk about, if only briefly, is affliction, or malheur. The French malheur is customarily translated by affliction, although Weil herself said that no English term was adequate to the condition that she was trying to describe. Weil distinguishes simple suffering from the extreme suffering and alienation that she calls malheur. Affliction is that which we cannot bear, but which we must bear. In Gravity and Grace, she says, affliction. Time bears the thinking being in spite of himself towards that which he cannot bear, and which will come all the same. Let this cup pass from me. They first discovered the nature of affliction, I think, in the contemporary world in the slavery of the industrial worker. But she came to see that the condition of slaves throughout history was an example of malheur. But the paragon, the exemplar of malheur, was Christ in Gethsemane praying, let this cup pass from me, Luke 22. And Christ crying out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me, in Matthew 27. In her essay, The Love of God in Affliction, Weil defines the afflicted person as the one whose whole life has been stolen from him by circumstances beyond his control. Affliction, she says, is an uprooting of life, a more or less attenuated equivalent of death, made irresistibly present to the soul by the attack or apprehension of physical pain. So affliction involves physical pain, but far more terrible is the distress of soul and social degradation that accompanies it. In her notebooks, she speaks of affliction as a quasi-hell on earth. But she also says in the notebooks that affliction can represent hell or else the gate to paradise. That is, if a person can be given the ability to consent to affliction, it can become redemptive as a form of decreation. Weil's describing malheur as a quasi-hell is reminiscent of the theme of mystical dereliction, in which a number of mystics, one example would be the 13th century German begging Mechthild of Magdeburg, testify to their sense of being rejected by God, consigned to hell. Mechthild memorably speaks of this condition in her Flowing Light of God as being placed under Lucifer's tail, under Lucifer's tail. Now, Weil knew the notion of affliction, I think, in the writings of John of the Cross, in his sense of the suffering of the dark night of the spirit. But she would not have been aware of the persistence of this theme of alienation in Catholic mysticism. And her notion of malheur contains things that are not present in most of the former mystics' notion of alienation, particularly the social dimension. Awareness of malheur, however much we ourselves do or do not experience it, is necessary as the infinite shock that nails us to the center of the universe beyond space and time, as she puts it, And it is only here that we were able to find God. Affliction is worse than mere suffering. Doesn't teach us a lesson about obedience, doesn't serve as a metaxu, but rather it forces upon us the experience of what Weil calls the void. We must, however, learn to accept affliction as best we can, because such acceptance is a quality of attention. Now, much of what Weil has to say about affliction is stark, even troubling, more to be pondered perhaps than analyzed, but it is essential to her thought. Final theme I want to talk about, just briefly, is annihilation and decreation. Simone Weil at times uses the language of annihilation, but more frequent in her writings are the terms decreation and detachment. She often speaks of decreation as the primordial action by which God withdrew himself, even tore his being apart, and thus allowed for the creation of the world. This tearing apart of God, however, gives us the possibility to decreate ourselves and unite with him. And so decreation and annihilation are not purely negative movements, but they are the foundation for recreation through loving action. God denied himself for our sakes in order to give us the possibility of denying ourselves for him. Decreation is a form of annihilation. God emptied himself of his divinity. We should empty ourselves of the false divinity with which we were born. May God grant me to become nothing. Insofar as I become nothing, God loves himself through me. Thus, decreation is a condition of egolessness, an egolessness that's vaguely similar to what many previous mystics had spoken of. Simone says, there's absolutely no other free act which is given to us to accomplish, only the destruction of the I. The I can be destroyed from the outside by affliction, which is this quasi-infernal suffering, or it can be destroyed from within by a free act of the subject. In both cases, the result is the absence of God. The absence of God expressed in the cry of Jesus, my God, why have you forsaken me? By this kind of redemptive suffering, God becomes present in extreme evil. God becomes present in extreme evil, paradoxical situation, which for me echoes the teaching of Marguerite Porete. Marguerite Porete's Mirror of Simple Annihilated Souls, chapter 40, almost a very, very close analogy to what Weil says in those particular passages. Finally, power of Weil's desire for decreation and annihilation is seen in what she called the example of prayer, a text found in her New York notebooks. She begins this prayer by asking the Father to take away everything from her, everything that belongs to her, and to make her everything that makes her human, as if she were in the last stage of decrepitude. But then she reverses this prayer, perhaps recognizing that it is not her will, but the will of God that should determine this annihilation. And she asks rather that there should be perfect conformity between all her actions and God's will. But then as this prayer continues, it goes on for about a page or more, the prayer reverses itself again, and she asks, and she says, may all this be stripped away from me, devoured by God, transformed into Christ's substance, given for food to the afflicted people whose bodies and soul lack every kind of nourishment. And she closes this prayer with another wrenching appeal for self-annihilation. She begs the Father, rend this body and soul away from me to make them things for your use. Let nothing remain of me forever, except this rendering, or else nothingness. So Simone Weil's life and thought exhibit paradoxes and problems. Nevertheless, I would argue that she is among the most important mystics of the past century, a figure whose honesty and perspicacity pierces through our easy answers to hard problems, our complacencies about how to live according to truth and love. In summarizing her life and message, I'd like to end by quoting what Father Perrin and Thibon, her closest friends and advisors, said in the introduction to their little book, Simone Weil as We Knew Her. They recognize both her genius and also the problematic aspects of her personality. But they say, it is for God alone to fathom the mystery of this soul and her destiny. So thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Bernard McGinn, for this wonderfully rich and dense but on the other hand, also very clear presentation and lecture you gave us on Simone Weil. We will now enter into the discussion, and we will, Andreas and me, we will open the discussion with some questions, and then we will open it for the whole auditory and also for the ones who are online. I will explain it later how we will do that. But maybe one question from my side. Thank you very much for explaining us a little bit some elements, some dimensions of Simone Weil's mysticism or mystical experience, also some moments in her life which were important. I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate a little bit more on the aspect of her encounter or her relation with the sacrament, with the Eucharist, and maybe also the role of the body in her spirituality or in her thinking in her life, because mysticism is very often related to this bodily dimension, and you already said she distinguishes between a bad mysticism and a good mysticism, and the bad one is looking for this special ecstatical experiences, and the good mysticism is more based on the attention. But nevertheless, she had a very, or the body was also problematic or ambivalent in her life. And so since we have here some liturgists and sacramental theologians, maybe this would be interesting for them. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, actually, Simone Weil's attitude towards the body is something that's been the subject of considerable literature. And like so much else in her thought, there seem to be sometimes paradoxes that are involved. Because she herself had a very strange attitude towards her body, as we know, in terms of the way in which she treated it. And nevertheless, I think that Simone Weil, like so many of the great mystics of the past century, they have overcome the kind of split or dichotomy between body and soul, which reigned throughout much of earlier Christian mysticism. That is, they tend to think in an embodied way. And they tend to recognize that any experience we can have of God is an embodied experience because that is the nature of the human being. Weil's own attitude towards her body and its difficulties is a part of the Weil literature, of course, and even with regard to her fasting and her seemingly disregard for her own health. But I don't think that personal attitude in any way denigrates from the fact that they, like someone like that Teilhard de Chardin and various others, emphasize the fact that the kind of separation between body and soul that was evident in much earlier mysticism is no longer tenable in the modern world.
Thank you. And maybe could you also say something about Simone Weil and the Eucharist? Because she, as I understood it, she felt on the one hand very much attracted to it, and also believed in the presence of Christ in the Eucharist. But on the other hand, she always remained on the threshold, or what is this sacramental dimension? Which role does it play also in her whole spiritual landscape or scheme?
Yes, no, that's a very interesting question, because you can draw out of her writings a tremendous sense of the importance of the Eucharist and of the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And of course, Father Perrin and various others, brought her close to baptism and tried to bring her to baptism itself, but she always held off. and therefore she never was able to receive the Eucharist. And this is the interesting question of Simone Weil's relationship to Catholicism, including a legend that maybe someone baptized her on her deathbed, etc. Simone Weil had decided, and I think very wisely, that she was not ready to be baptized. And I think most of the clergy and priests who talked to her came to that realization as well. Her strong a bond of not only affection but unity with Catholic thinking is evident, but there were points of opposition, there were points of tension that she could never overcome, and points of tension that I think the priests who talked to her also realized were a kind of separation. Among those, of course, was as I said, the relationship of the cross and the resurrected Christ. Another one, of course, was Simone Weil's tremendous sympathy for Manichaean and other dualist traditions. So there are places where Simone Weil feels herself as Catholic, which she always said she did. And there are other places where she feels herself in tension with the church, not only the church's bad history of Inquisition and Crusades and other things, which we all feel wretched about, but things that are central to the church's message. And I think that is part of the paradox that we have to talk about when we talk about Simone Weil. There are paradoxes that she was never able to overcome.
Thank you very much. I would have one last question,
Sure.
which is urgent for me. You have now described as Simone Weil also with this aspect of decreation and annihilation, as a quite apophatic thinker. You also said it in your introduction as an apophatic mystic. Where would you see then the difference and for instance, an secular atheistic nihilism? So if there is not, if the resurrection is not there, where would you see the difference? And maybe a dimension of hope, or is it this affirmation, this acceptance of this malheur, so would you see any difference?
Well, I think Simone Weil is one of those 20th century figures who can appeal to people who are on the margins or even outside the church. And this is one of the characteristics of many of the, 20th century figures. They are figures that live on the margin. Eddie Hillesum is another very good example. And because they live on the margin, they can appeal not only to people who are within faith communities and traditions, but also to people who are outside those, but who are still seriously, really looking for value, for God, or for some supreme value. And this, I think, is, as I said, characteristic of many of the figures in the 20th century. And that's why I think Simone Weil is such a popular and widely read figure, and so meaningful to many people. It was very interesting. I began reading her in the 1950s when I was in school, and I didn't read much afterwards. When in my teaching at the University of Chicago Divinity School, I discovered probably in the 1980s and in the 1990s, so many people, particularly younger women, who came and who were so inspired by Simone Weil, and they're turned towards studying religion in a more serious way. That in that sense, she was a catalyst who was able to turn people to a more serious study of religion. And we had David Tracy and myself were able to have a number of different students who did dissertations on Simone Weil.
Mm-hmm.
And I think she still has that function in the contemporary world.
And maybe so also because of her metaxy, or not being so being in the middle or being between the religious traditions, she can talk to even more people, or she found, or she can speak to people, as you said, who also our religious identities are often very broken nowadays, or are often quite mixed up, or so not so pure.
Exactly. No, I exactly agree with that. I mean, that's why she and I put her in, they're very different people, but she and Eddie Hillesum in a certain way have a number of striking similarities, not only in their appeal, but also that tremendous necessity to kneel, which I mentioned before, which is kind of the break with the egoism that they had at an earlier stage. Some force beyond them forces them to kneel. Both of these are Jewish women for whom kneeling was not an aspect even of the traditional prayer in their tradition, but they are being forced to kneel as a sign that there's a higher power trying to act on them.
Thank you very much that they're making this bridge to atheism, because we had a study day here in Sant'Anselmo in November last year, and their atheism made part of the persons or the mystical figures who were treated. We want to open the discussion now for the auditory, and the mode is please, the ones who are here in presence, they should come here in front, that Bernard McGinn can also see you, because he doesn't see the auditory at the moment.
Yes,
so
okay.
please give a hand sign if you want to ask a question or a comment or say something, and then you come here. The other ones online, please, they also make this hand sign with this online hand sign, or write in the chat. You can also write your question in the chat, and so Kimberly and Annalisa, they are controlling a little bit this written communication. So, and now, yeah, I share the screen. Yeah.
Please come forward, please.
Professor, thank you very much for this talk.
Thank you.
I'm Maria. I'm from Portugal, so where the first event happened to Simone Weil. I'm very interested in an Italian writer called Cristina Campo, that is one of the first who translates Simone Weil into Italian. And when she published Simone Weil, she writes a very provocative preface in where she does a very harsh critique and claim of her. She likes her very much, as me. Like I really like Simone Weil. I read her a lot. I have a big admiration. But she says that rather than writing a great Christian classic, she wrote a great pre-Christian classic, that she lacked a very good spiritual mentor because she was not introduced with to the church fathers or to the councils. She believes that Father Perrin was very soft with her, more sentimental than spiritual, and that yes, that she lacked the knowledge of the most ancient and classic tradition of the church, and that this would have been very important for her. I don't know. This comment was very illuminating for me when I read it, because I always thought, what did she miss? No, she was so close with such a good sensibility. She really saw things well, and I think this. I don't know. I wanted to share and to ask your opinion about this. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the question, which I think, or observation, which I think is a very important one. Let me start. Simone Weil is a difficult woman. She's a brilliant woman, and as I think she can be a guide to many of us, but she was not an easy person in life, and she's not even an easy person to read. And there is a sense in which she is a kind of pre-Christian figure. Her tremendous admiration for the Greeks, or at least what she thought the Greeks were. I think that's a better term. But her admiration for what she thought the Greek and Greek contribution was, in a certain sense, is pre-Christian. But what breaks in here, I think, in her life is the experience of Christ. And it's trying to put together her experience of Christ with the values that she had come from out of her philosophical reading and her great admiration for the Greeks. So again, I fall back on this term paradox. Her life, as her teaching, is filled with paradoxes. And at times she's extremely difficult. She's a very difficult person for many of her friends. She kept some of her friends, but others she kind of turned against, which I think is very odd when you read her life story. So I have not read the Italian translation that you're mentioning, but your summary of it is one that I would tend to agree with. And again, I would never want to put Simone Weil on some kind of pedestal. She's too important for that. But we need to read her. We need to think along with her. We need to look at her witness and to see what we can learn. That would be my reaction to that.
Thank you very much. We have several voices, several people from online who want to ask a question. I first ask Eddie Howells.
Eddie Howells, yes.
Hi, thank you very much, Bernie. And
Hi, Eddie.
Nice to see you and hear your lecture. I was thinking when you were speaking of this picture of Simone Weil's of kind of seeing the whole of creation and a perspective which is above creation, looking at creation that she gives. For instance, at the end of the Love of God and Affliction essay, the soul can cross the totality of space and time and come into the very presence of God.
Yes.
This is sort of this ability to see everything at once, so that love and suffering and God and creation. She talks about the sort of vibration that of seeing it all at once, and I wonder if this very much affects her understanding of Christ and the temporal sequence of death and resurrection, in the sense that if it's simultaneous, we can't have a process from death to resurrection. I don't know. I'm just making this up to try and work out why she doesn't get to resurrection. But also the way that we're included in this is that from this perspective, all human suffering is Christ's suffering and is kind of seen all at once, and is co-redemptive.
Yes.
And it's sort of trying to manage that simultaneity of everything that maybe creates some problems when putting it back into a temporal sequence. I don't know.
Yeah, no, thanks, Eddie. I mean, that's a very penetrating kind of perspective. I've wrestled with Weil on the relationship of resurrection to cross. And there are texts in her writings where she basically says, oh, I can't understand resurrection. Why did Jesus ever rise? There are other texts where she seems to adopt a position, something like what you're talking about, but she doesn't explain exactly why to us. And I think the point that you're making about the way in which she can at times look from the eternal perspective about the simultaneity of all these different, that may be one way of getting at it. I don't know. I would have to think that through. When I read Weil, I'm often I get the sense that there are threads that are not yet tied together, but that she felt somehow that she could put together. But of course, she died so young, and who knows what she would have been able to write at some later time. I mean, the notebooks are fascinating to read because they're filled with these brilliant and original observations, but at times you wonder how they all come together in a certain sense. So maybe that perspective would be one way to try to put together things that we find hard to understand in her.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Eddie. Thanks.
Thank you. The second person online is Jack, who raised his hand.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thanks, Bernard, for your talk. Very, very interesting. Sort of a question about Simone's Christology. If you think she had one as such that was sort of, you're just sort of saying that maybe there's unfinished threads, but if there's this sense that creation itself is almost the crucifixion from the beginning of time, that there's
Exactly.
Is the incarnation to kind of concretely show God's complete withdrawal in a person? And is Jesus is he fully human and fully divine in her eyes? And does that demonstrate the decreation of both in one person? And so like ultimate union in that one person of Christ in that sense?
I think that comes close to what she's really trying to do, because the whole process of the return to God really comes in two stages. God has to decreate himself in order for the possibility of all things to return to God, which they return through the incarnation and through the passion. Those are two fundamental stages. And it's Christ's suffering on the cross which allows his union with the Father to take place. So that I think that there is a powerful Christology throughout Simone Weil's writings, but not an explicit Christology. And we have to kind of reconstruct it in the best ways that we can. But for her, the figure of Christ is absolutely essential. And it's both Christ as the incarnate Son of God, but also the Christ who can only realize his destiny as incarnate Son of God by decreating himself through the most severe affliction on the cross. There's a lot that's been written, of course, on Simone Weil's thought. I've read I think all of her writings. I've read a number of interpreters, but there are those who spend their whole life with Simone Weil, from whom I have learned so much. They might well be able to answer that question better than I.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you. We now have several questions in the chat. Diana Goddard writes, was Simone aware of Julian of Norwich, who also had this bodily apprehension of Christ? And also, do you agree, as Karl Rahner wrote, is that mysticism is the way forward?
I do not think that Simone Weil was aware of Julian. As I said, her knowledge of the Catholic mystical tradition was very spotty. And we have to accept that. And of course, remember, a lot of these figures in the 1930s were not as well known as they are today, although Julian of Norwich was certainly read in the English-speaking world. So I don't think she knew Julian. It would have been fascinating had she read Julian. And of course, I cite over and over again the famous statement from Karl Rahner: the Christian of the future will either be a mystic or will not be a Christian at all. For me, that's kind of a bedrock of my understanding of the role of mysticism in the contemporary church and the contemporary world.
Thank you. And then Hosea Sheen writes, could you elaborate about her concern with regard to the resurrection?
Yeah, well, in my article in Modern Mystics, I cite a number of those texts where she really gives one the sense that it would have been better if Christ had not risen from the dead. For her, the Christ suffering on the cross, which reunites him to the Father and becomes the model for how we are to face affliction, is what's foremost in her mind. And she feels there's a kind of triumphalism to many Christian notions of the resurrected Christ. And I think that's true. You know, there is a sense in at least some Christian authors about the resurrection. I mean, this is a triumphal of now everything is going to be all right. For Simone Weil, that was very dangerous. There are other places, a few places in her writings, and I cite them in my essay, where she seems to try to tease out a more positive notion of the meaning of the resurrection. But those passages, I think, are less than the ones that say, well, there's a real problem with the understanding of the resurrection. I think, as in many other ways, Weil is pointing to something. And that something is a notion of the resurrection that says, oh, everything is going to be all right now. And Christ has finally triumphed over everything. And for Simone Weil, that's misunderstanding, in a certain sense, the nature of Christ, because Christ still suffers until the end of the world, as we're told in the Christian tradition, and he will be suffering.
So I was always seeing here a similarity to Johann Baptist Metz, for instance, to his idea also of or to his attention to the scream or the suffering of the people today, and not jumping immediately to the triumphalist or Christ of resurrection.
Exactly. No, I think that's Metz is a very good example of someone who pointed that out as well. So again, Simone Weil is pointing in the direction certain contemporary theologians, or modern theologians at least, have also tried to correct some traditional misunderstandings of what resurrection might mean.
Sorana Laura, would you want to come here? No, she does not want. Okay, then I read out her question. Could you say a little bit more about the problematic aspect of a personality? What do you exactly mean?
Yes, well, she was very self-willed. And of course, this again is the paradox of her personality, and not only her paradox, but that of others. I mean, her whole notion about destroying her will, and yet she was an extremely willful person when she got an idea in her head that had to be done. One of the examples, of course, is late in her life, and when she was very, very ill, but she conceived the notion of forming a kind of death squad of nurses to go and parachute themselves onto the front lines in order to help, the Free French fighters fighting against the Nazis. And she tried to convince the Free French and Charles de Gaulle and the others, and they thought she was crazy. Charles de Gaulle says she was crazy, but she was obsessed with this. And some of her friends tried to caution her about this, and she became very angry with some of these friends who tried to dissuade her from what to almost anybody seems like a kind of crazy idea. So I find in her a paradox of someone whose whole teaching is to give up self-will, and yet in her own way was very self-willed.
I was wondering about that aspect because in your article you emphasized the obedience as well, or the term obedience in
obedience is a crucial area in her thought, exactly.
But then my question would be to whom she is obedient, or yeah.
Well, I think she felt she was obedient to God, or she was trying to be obedient to God, insofar as she understood that. She's certainly not obedient to any external authority, be it the authority of the church or whatever. But she felt that she was trying to fulfill God's will in her life insofar as she could see it. I think that's very, very evident in the course of her life. But an outsider can say, well, can make a judgment and say, well, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? Why are you turning against some of your friends when they don't agree with some of your schemes? And those are legitimate questions. She kept certain very close friends throughout the course of her life, but she had breaks with other people who were once friendly with her because they tried to correct her on certain kinds of issues and said, you shouldn't do that. That doesn't really make sense, etc. That's what I mean by the difficulties in her personality. Mm-hmm. And of course, we all judge other people in our own ways. And I never met her. I just read about her and read her. But I don't think she was an easy person.
I agree. Solomon writes, what is the relevance of the mystical experience and or comprehension of mysticism of Simone to the 21st century priest or theologian in relation to personal and spiritual life and the liturgical perspective?
Well, I would go back to that quotation that I had from Theology. She doesn't give us answers, she addresses us with questions. And I think that's very, very important because the thing that, for me at least, in terms of the late 20th century now into the 21st century, is that we can't take things for granted. We need to ask questions, and we need to ask them very seriously. And when we think we have, the easy answer already, we need to listen to those who say, no, that's not the easy answer. I think that's what she lived. And I think that's what she addresses to us as a way of living.
Thank you. Then we have a Jack again. Could her focus on the cross also be part of her affection for geometry as opposed to the resurrection, which you might see as more akin to algebra?
Huh. I've never thought of that. And I'm not sure I'm not sure I have a correct answer to that. But it's an interesting question to contemplate. And of course, Simone Weil did have great love both for mathematics and geometry. But I'm going to pass on that one.
We will take it with us, the question, for a further study day. Then Simone Weil often wrote that Plato was a mystic and even the father of mysticism. How do you interpret this?
I would tend to agree with that. We can explain that in different kinds of ways, but I think that mysticism is not just an element within the Christian religion, it's an element within certain great philosophical traditions. So I think of Plato as a mystic. I think of Plotinus as a mystic. Just to speak of people within the Western tradition who are not within the Catholic tradition. So I would agree with her with Simone Weil very strongly in her admiration for Plato, and particularly those elements in his thought who are mystical. And even more, I don't think she talks much about Plotinus, but I've always found Plotinus, in a certain sense, a more pure example of mysticism within the Greek philosophical tradition.
Thank you. Tom Sawyer also wrote a question. First, he thanks you for the enriching lecture. And then his question is, Simone Weil sees Christ reflected in a remarkably wide range of figures and forms, Antigone, mathematical formulas, Odin, Krishna, and much more, and conversely sees many figures and forms reflected in Christ. Given such an expansive understanding of Christ, can one still speak of a distinctively Christian Christology?
Yes, well, that's a very penetrating question, and it gets back to what I noted, Weil's consideration of mysticism as a kind of universal and unchanging phenomenon found in all traditions. I frankly don't agree with that. I think that there are various forms of mysticism that play out in different religious traditions that certainly have comparable features that need to enter into discussion with an attempt for mutual understanding, but that there are real differences between the mysticisms in the various traditions, and also real differences between the saving figures in other traditions and the figure of Christ. Oh, and so I would disagree with that aspect of her thought that says that all salvific figures, and she names many of these in other traditions, are really aspects of Christ. I don't necessarily feel that that's the case.
Thank you.
And of course, I might just add one. When she wrote in the 1930s, there was a very strong tradition, and it still exists today, about all mysticism being one. You know, under the various manifestations of the different religions, mysticism was one phenomenon. Today, I think correctly, those who study mysticism have moved away from that essentializing of the common core of mysticism into a much more diverse understanding of the phenomenon. But that's still a question for argument among students of mysticism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's true. Thank you. We have another question from Kimberly. She asks, Weil claims that the cry of the afflicted requires attention, not rites or dialogue. Is this a profound insight into human dignity? Or does it offer a politically passive framework that prioritizes the spiritual state of the witness over the actual systemic removal of suffering?
I don't think the two need to be considered in a disjunctive way. I think her first movement towards it demands our attention and our understanding, that doesn't preclude the possibility of working to overcome the forms of affliction through political action. Let's remember that she was very politically involved in the 1930s, both in the question of the proletarian workers in France and in the question, of course, of the Civil War in Spain, etc. So I think you can emphasize the necessity for the attention to the afflicted and still work to overcome the affliction that they're suffering.
Thank you. We are now slowly coming to the end of our time, but there would be the time for, one, two short questions. Is there somebody, so either from here, from the auditorium presence, or also from somebody online? Just give a sign if you want to come out or if you want to speak out. I don't see, so there. Thank you. Then maybe, do you want to have a last word? No. No. Okay, then. Maybe so. If because you already draw you already made this relation to antihelism, and I must admit I'm very interested in antihelism, and I already presented her here in Sant'Anselmo, and then also to the students of the Jerusalem Studienjahr who are here at the moment. And therefore, I would ask you, or I wanted to ask you, so you presented us now Simone Weil, a Jewish young woman as well, very active, politically active, attracted to the gospel, or at least to some aspects of it, above all to the kenotic parts.
Yes.
And we find the same also in antihelism. So also antihelism, as you mentioned already, both were keen or were attracted by the kneeling of this Catholic or Christian tradition of regarding prayer. But both of them also shared this affinity for this kenotic Christological elements or dimensions. Would you, if you, but you also said you now draw more on the apophatic negative dimensions in Simone Weil, but said you didn't mention beauty, the beauty, or that.
Yes.
So you had, of course, you had to reduce yourself to some specific elements and couldn't elaborate all of them. Antihelism is more often considered as a person who emphasizes the aspect of the beauty in the world, of the life is beautiful. This is cited so often in her writings. But she also has this aspect of, or integrates this dimension of bearing the suffering, or bearing, we could say the malheur with Simone Weil. Maybe could you draw a short comparison between, or simply outline some maybe differences, but also with something which unites them, these two figures? Briefly, I know.
Well, what you're asking me to do is to write a book, I think, in a sense. No, I'm fascinated with both of these figures. And I came to antihelism much later. I was reading Simone Weil early on from the 1950s when she first came into English. But I discovered antihelism through students who came and who had been reading her and found her life and witness very important for their own spiritual dimension. And it would be, I think, a very profitable and useful enterprise to do a full-length study that would compare these two figures, that would, as you suggest, both look at certain very real common themes, and yet also some significant differences, both in their lives and in their thinking. I don't think I'm quite prepared to do that on a short term at this stage, but I would sincerely, recommend to some younger person than myself that this would be a very enterprising and important work for the future study of mysticism in the 21st century. I find reading these two women mystics, to be among the most inspiring and also in some ways, the most difficult figures to work with in 20th century mysticism. So you should maybe undertake this work yourself.
Yeah, thank you very much for the recommendation. I will consider it. No. Thank you very much at this point for your lecture, for your beautiful lecture, and also for answering us all these questions, for discussing with us and reflecting with us. It was a beautiful evening, really enriching for our studies here here in Sant'Anselmo. The students study above all the monastic tradition, so the medieval authors, but therefore it's even more enriching to have sometimes this open the window to have a look into the contemporary or modern times authors, spiritual figures. So thank you very much for sharing with us all the richness of your studies. Thanks also to Andreas Telser, my colleague from Vienna, from Austria, who indeed organized and made contact with you for us. Thank you very, very much for this mediation. It's always a pleasure to work with you together. And then thank you all who have come here, who have discussed with us and who are present and listened. I hope you will have a beautiful further evening and that this lecture will also inspire your further reflections on mysticism, on spirituality, on Christology, or also then on the sacramental dimension and so forth. Thanks a lot to you all, also to you who were online. I hope we will meet again in one or another occasion. Thank you and good night.
Tante grazie tutti.
Thanks, Bernard. Thanks so much for being with us.
And Isabella. Thank you both for the invitation. It's wonderful.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay, let's see. We should be able to get out of this. I'm going to see them.